Picture this scenario and try to imagine yourself in this situation. It's 6 a.m. on a cold, damp morning in medieval France, sometime around the year 1395, and you're a royal servant walking into the king's chambers for your regular morning duties. Your wooden shoes echo softly against the cold stone floors as you approach the massive oak doors that separate you from your employer, the most powerful man in all of France. You're carrying fresh linens, maybe some warm bread, perhaps a goblet of wine for His Majesty's breakfast. You expect to find King Charles VI getting dressed for court, reviewing important documents with his advisors, or eating breakfast like any normal king would do on any normal morning. But instead, as you push open those heavy doors, you discover him cowering in the corner of his enormous four-poster bed like a terrified animal. He's wrapped in expensive silk blankets like a frightened child hiding from monsters. His eyes are wide with absolute terror, darting around the room as if invisible enemies are lurking in every shadow. His unwashed hair is matted against his sweaty forehead. And he's refusing to move even a single inch, not even to reach for food or water, because he genuinely, completely, wholeheartedly believes that his entire body is made of glass. Not metaphorically, not as some kind of poetic expression or royal eccentricity. He literally thinks his flesh, his bones, his organs, everything that makes up his physical being is composed of fragile, delicate glass that could shatter into 1,000 pieces with one wrong movement, one sudden jolt, one unexpected sound. You try to speak to him in your normal voice, but he immediately shrieks at you to whisper because loud voices create vibrations that travel through the air and through the stone floors, and these vibrations could crack his glass body like a hammer striking a wine goblet. You attempt to help him out of bed so he can start his royal duties, but he recoils in absolute horror because human touch, even the gentlest contact, might break his imaginary glass skin. You offer him food, but he's convinced that chewing might cause his glass teeth to shatter. You suggest he needs to bathe, but he believes water could cause his glass body to crack from temperature changes. This isn't some fairy tale or fantasy story dreamed up by medieval storytellers looking for entertainment. This isn't some exaggerated legend passed down through generations and embellished over time. This actually happened, documented by court historians and witnessed by hundreds of people. For over 30 years, from 1392 until his death in 1422, the servants, courtiers, guards, cooks, cleaners, and entire staff of King Charles VI of France had to deal with a monarch who was completely, certifiably, dangerously insane. And today we're going to explore in vivid detail what it was really like to work for someone whose grip on reality was more fragile than the glass he thought he was made of. We're going to walk through the daily nightmare, the psychological horror, the constant fear of serving a king who could go from perfectly normal conversation to violent psychotic episode in the span of minutes. Imagine trying to explain to your family and friends that your boss, the King of France, thinks he's a piece of delicate crystal walking around in human form. Imagine having to completely restructure your entire work routine, your daily schedule, your basic human interactions around the delusion that sound waves might kill your employer. Imagine tiptoeing through marble hallways, communicating only in whispers, and living in constant terror that your mentally unstable boss might suddenly decide you're an enemy spy and attack you with a sword. Because that happened too. Multiple times. People died. This is the story of the most psychologically demanding, terrifying, and completely bizarre job in all of medieval history. Being a servant to a mad king. To understand just how absolutely insane this situation was, we need to step back and look at what France was like in the late 1300s, because this country was already a complete disaster even before their king lost his mind. Picture medieval Europe as a continent-sized horror movie, and France was right in the middle of every single nightmare scenario you could possibly imagine. First, let's talk about the Black Death, the bubonic plague that had swept through Europe just a few decades earlier, killing somewhere between 75 and 200 million people, which was roughly 30 to 60% of Europe's entire population. Imagine every third person you know just dying horrible, agonizing deaths within a few years. Entire cities were abandoned. Farms were left empty. The economic system collapsed. Survivors were traumatized beyond belief, and many people genuinely thought the world was ending, that God was punishing humanity for their sins. Meanwhile, France was stuck in the middle of the 100 Years' War with England, which meant constant battles, burned villages, murdered civilians, and economic devastation. English armies would march through French territory, destroying everything in their path just because they could. French peasants lived in constant fear that foreign soldiers might show up at any moment to kill them, rape their wives and daughters, steal their food, and burn their homes to the ground. On top of all this chaos, the medieval Catholic Church controlled almost every aspect of daily life, and people believed in some absolutely wild stuff that would make modern conspiracy theories look rational. They thought diseases were caused by bad smells in the air. They believed that looking at certain animals could kill you. They were convinced that demons could possess your body if you ate the wrong foods. They thought mental illness was either a punishment from God for secret sins, or evidence that devils had taken control of your soul. Medical knowledge was basically non-existent, so when someone got sick, the standard treatments involved bloodletting, which meant cutting people open to drain their blood, trepanation, which was drilling holes in their skulls, or exorcism, which was having priests scream at them to drive out demons. Now imagine being a king in this environment. You're responsible for millions of people who are dying from plagues, being murdered by foreign armies, living in constant fear, and looking to you for protection and leadership. The pressure alone would drive most modern people to nervous breakdowns. But here's the thing that made Charles VI's situation even worse. Medieval kings weren't just political leaders, they were considered divinely chosen by God himself. People literally believed that the king's health and mental state were directly connected to the health of the entire kingdom. If the king was sick, it meant God was angry with the nation. If the king was acting strangely, it could be a sign that the apocalypse was coming. So when Charles VI started showing signs of mental illness, it wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was a national crisis that threatened the spiritual and political stability of the entire country. His servants weren't just dealing with a difficult boss, they were trying to keep the Kingdom of France from collapsing into complete chaos while hiding the fact that their divinely appointed ruler was completely insane. And remember, this was an era where information traveled at the speed of horses. There was no internet, no television, no newspapers, no way to quickly communicate across long distances. If word got out that the king was mentally unstable, it could take months for the news to spread, but once it did, it could trigger rebellions, invasions, or complete social collapse. The servants working in Charles VI's court were literally holding together one of Europe's most important kingdoms through sheer willpower and secrecy, all while their boss was convinced he was made of glass and might attack them with weapons at any moment. This was the perfect storm of historical circumstances that created the most stressful job in human history. Now, to make this story even more bizarre, we need to understand the absolutely insane culture that medieval royalty lived in, because even when kings were mentally healthy, they existed in a bubble of reality that was completely detached from normal human experience. Imagine the most privileged, sheltered, out-of-touch celebrity you can think of, then multiply that by 1,000, add divine authority, and remove any possibility of criticism or reality checks. That was medieval royal culture. Kings were told from birth that they were chosen by God himself, that their blood was literally different from other humans, and that they possessed magical healing powers just by touching people. Charles VI grew up believing that he could cure diseases just by laying his hands on sick individuals, which was called the royal touch, and thousands of people would line up hoping the king's magical fingers could heal their ailments. The royal court was filled with hundreds of nobles, advisors, and servants whose entire existence depended on keeping the king happy, which meant constantly telling him exactly what he wanted to hear, never contradicting him, and treating his every random thought as profound wisdom. If the king said something completely stupid, everyone around him would nod and praise his brilliant insight. If the king wanted something impossible, armies of people would scramble to make it happen or at least create the illusion that it was happening. This created an environment where reality was completely optional, and the king's perception of the world was the only version that mattered. Medical knowledge in the 14th century was based on completely insane theories that would make astrology look scientific. Doctors believed that all diseases were caused by imbalances of 4 bodily fluids called humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. They thought you could diagnose someone's health by examining their urine, not through chemical analysis, but by looking at its color and sometimes tasting it to check the flavor. They believed that mental illness was caused by too much black bile in the brain, and the standard treatment was to drill holes in the patient's skull to let the evil humors escape, or to make them vomit violently to purge the bad fluids from their system. When Charles VI started showing signs of mental problems, the royal physicians came up with explanations that were somehow even crazier than his actual symptoms. Some doctors claimed that he had been cursed by witches who were working for England. Others insisted that demons had possessed his body because someone in the court was secretly practicing witchcraft. A few medical experts decided that the king's brain had been overheated by excessive thinking, and they prescribed treatments that involved packing his head in ice, feeding him cold foods, and keeping him in dark rooms to cool down his overactive mind. One particularly creative physician suggested that Charles VI's madness was caused by having too much royal blood in his system, and the cure was to carefully drain some of it out while replacing it with peasant blood from healthy commoners. The court culture also included some absolutely wild entertainment that would be considered insane by modern standards. Royal parties featured live bears dancing with humans, elaborate theatrical performances where actors pretended to be mythological creatures, and something called living tableaus, where groups of people would pose motionless for hours to recreate famous religious scenes while guests watched and commented on their performance. There were court jesters whose job was to insult the king in creative ways, because apparently medieval royalty found public humiliation amusing as long as it came from designated entertainment professionals. They had food tasters whose entire career was eating everything before the king did, just in case someone had poisoned his meals, which meant these people were essentially professional poison detectors who risked death with every bite. The royal household included dozens of servants whose only job was to take care of specific items. There were people whose entire life purpose was maintaining the king's hats, others who exclusively managed his shoes, specialists who only handled his eating utensils, and individuals whose sole responsibility was carrying around special cushions in case the king wanted to sit down somewhere unexpected. This level of absurd specialization meant that simple tasks like getting dressed could involve 15 different people, each responsible for one tiny aspect of the process. When you combine this bubble of unreality with genuine mental illness, you get a situation where nobody could tell the difference between royal eccentricity and dangerous psychosis. In a culture where the king's every whim was treated as divine commandment, how do you distinguish between His Majesty has unique preferences, and His Majesty is completely detached from reality and might kill someone? The servants working for Charles VI had to navigate this impossible situation every single day, trying to maintain royal protocol while secretly managing a mentally unstable boss who could become violently unpredictable at any moment. So when exactly did everyone realize that their king had completely lost his mind? Well, there was one specific moment that changed everything, and it happened in the most terrifying way possible. August 5, 1392, is a date that every servant in the French royal court would remember for the rest of their lives, because that's when Charles VI went from being a slightly eccentric king to a genuinely dangerous madman who could kill people without warning. The king was traveling through the forest of Le Mans with a large entourage of knights, nobles, and servants, heading to Brittany to deal with some political issues. This was supposed to be a routine royal journey, the kind of trip that happened dozens of times every year. Charles VI was 24 years old, had been king for about 12 years, and up until this point he seemed like a relatively normal medieval monarch. Sure, he had some strange habits and occasional mood swings, but nothing that seemed particularly alarming compared to other royalty. The weather was extremely hot that day, which was already putting everyone in a bad mood, and the king had been acting more irritable than usual during the journey. His servants noticed that he seemed restless and kept complaining about feeling watched, but they assumed he was just tired from traveling. The royal procession included about 100 people on horseback, with the king riding near the front surrounded by his closest advisors and bodyguards. Everything seemed perfectly normal until they reached a particularly dense section of the forest where the trees blocked out most of the sunlight. Suddenly, without any warning whatsoever, a raggedly dressed man appeared from behind some bushes and grabbed the bridle of the king's horse. This stranger looked like a hermit or maybe a beggar, with wild hair and tattered clothes, and he started shouting warnings at Charles VI. The man claimed to be a prophet sent by God, and he was screaming that the king was surrounded by traitors who were planning to betray him. He pointed at the nobles riding with Charles VI and accused them of being secret enemies working for foreign powers. Now, in medieval times, people took prophets and religious warnings very seriously, so this wasn't the kind of encounter you could just ignore. But instead of calmly listening to the man's message or having his guards peacefully remove the stranger, something inside Charles VI's brain just snapped completely. His eyes went wide with terror, and he started screaming that the hermit was right, that everyone around him was a traitor trying to kill him. The king drew his sword and began attacking his own knights and advisors, the same people who had been loyally serving him for years. He was swinging his weapon wildly, trying to cut down anyone within reach, including servants who were just trying to stay out of the way. Charles VI was shouting that he needed to defend himself against assassins, but the only people around him were his own court members who were desperately trying to avoid being killed by their own king. The scene was absolute chaos. Horses were rearing up and throwing their riders. Servants were diving behind trees to avoid being cut down by the royal sword. Knights were trying to disarm their king without hurting him, which was incredibly difficult because he was fighting like a man possessed. Some of the nobles were shouting orders, trying to organize a response, but nobody knew what to do because this situation had never happened before in French history. How do you restrain a king who's trying to murder his own court? After several terrifying minutes of violence, the king's brother, Louis of Orleans, managed to wrestle the sword away from Charles VI. but not before the king had killed 4 of his own men and seriously wounded several others. Once they got the weapon away from him, Charles VI suddenly collapsed as if all the energy had drained out of his body. He seemed confused and disoriented, like someone waking up from a nightmare, and he had no memory of what had just happened. When they told him that he had attacked his own people, he refused to believe it and accused them of lying to him. The surviving members of the royal entourage were left staring at their king, who was now sitting on the ground looking completely lost and confused, while the bodies of loyal servants lay scattered around them. This was the moment when everyone realized that something was fundamentally wrong with Charles VI's mind, and their jobs had just become infinitely more dangerous and complicated. Imagine being one of the servants who witnessed this terrifying attack, and now you have to figure out what the hell you're supposed to do next. You've just watched your king, the man who holds the power of life and death over your entire family, brutally murder 4 people for absolutely no reason, and then act like nothing happened. How do you even begin to process something like that? The immediate aftermath of the Forest of Le Mans incident was complete chaos, because nobody in the royal court had any experience dealing with a homicidal monarch, and there was no medieval handbook titled, "What to Do When Your Boss Goes Completely Insane and Starts Killing People." The first reaction from most of the surviving court members was complete denial. They simply refused to believe that what they had just witnessed was real. Some of the nobles started creating alternative explanations for what had happened, insisting that the king must have been poisoned by enemy agents, or that he had been temporarily possessed by demons, or that the whole incident was some kind of elaborate test to see how loyal his followers were. A few people even suggested that Charles VI had been perfectly rational and that the men he killed must have actually been traitors, even though everyone knew that wasn't true. The servants were in an impossible position because they had to continue doing their jobs while pretending that their employer hadn't just committed multiple murders. They still needed to set up the royal tent for the night, prepare the king's meals, help him get dressed, and maintain all the normal routines of court life. But now they were also terrified that he might suddenly decide any one of them was a traitor and attack them without warning. Every time Charles VI reached for any object that could be used as a weapon, his servants would tense up and prepare to run for their lives. When he asked for a knife to cut his food, multiple people would watch him carefully to make sure he was only using it for eating. When he requested his sword for ceremonial purposes, his bodyguards would find excuses to delay bringing it to him or would make sure they outnumbered him significantly before handing over any weapons. The king's personal servants, the people who helped him bathe, get dressed, and eat his meals, were now working in a state of constant terror. They had to maintain the illusion of normal royal protocol while secretly treating their employer like a dangerous wild animal that might attack at any moment. They developed subtle communication systems, using hand signals and coded phrases to warn each other when the king seemed to be getting agitated or showing signs of potential violence. They started working in groups instead of alone, so that if Charles VI had another violent episode, there would be multiple people available to either restrain him or run for help. The nobles and advisors faced a different but equally terrifying problem. They had to decide whether to report this incident to other European courts, to the church, or to the French people. If word got out that the King of France was mentally unstable and dangerous, it could trigger invasions from enemy countries, rebellions from French nobles who wanted to seize power, or complete loss of confidence in the royal government. But they also couldn't just pretend it never happened because too many people had witnessed the attack, and the families of the dead men deserved explanations. They decided to spread a carefully crafted story claiming that the king had been temporarily afflicted by a mysterious illness, possibly caused by the extreme heat, and that he was now fully recovered. This was obviously a lie, but it was the kind of lie that everyone could publicly accept while privately knowing the truth. The church officials who traveled with the royal court had their own theories about what was happening. Some priests insisted that Charles VI's violent behavior was evidence of demonic possession, and they wanted to perform exorcisms to drive out the evil spirits. Other religious leaders claimed that the king's madness was a punishment from God for some secret sin, and they demanded that he confess his crimes and do penance to restore his sanity. A few particularly creative clergy members suggested that the entire incident was actually a miracle, arguing that God had given the king supernatural strength and insight to identify and eliminate hidden traitors in his court. The most terrifying aspect of this situation was that nobody knew if the Forest of Le Mans incident was a one-time occurrence or the beginning of a pattern. Would Charles VI return to normal and never have another episode? Or was this just the first sign of ongoing mental deterioration? The servants and court members were left in a state of constant anxiety, never knowing when their king might suddenly snap and start attacking people again. They had to continue their daily routines while living in fear that any day could be their last, and they couldn't even talk openly about their concerns because acknowledging the king's mental illness would be considered treason. After the Forest of Le Mans incident, the royal court was desperate to find some kind of explanation and treatment for the king's behavior, so they did what any rational medieval government would do: they called in the medical experts. And by medical experts, I mean a collection of quacks, charlatans, and well-meaning idiots whose understanding of mental health was roughly equivalent to a modern toddler's understanding of rocket science. The royal physicians who were summoned to examine Charles VI represented the absolute pinnacle of 14th century medical knowledge, which means they were completely clueless but very confident about their completely wrong theories. These were the most educated, respected doctors in all of France, men who had studied at the finest universities and treated the most important nobles in the kingdom. They were also operating with medical knowledge that was based on ancient Greek theories that had been wrong for over 1,000 years, mixed with random religious superstitions and folk remedies that had no basis in reality whatsoever. The head royal physician, a man named Guillaume de Harsigny, who was considered a genius in his time, examined the king and immediately diagnosed him with an excess of melancholic humors in his brain. According to medieval medical theory, all mental and physical health problems were caused by imbalances between four bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Guillaume decided that Charles VI had too much black bile, which was supposedly the humor that controlled sadness and madness, and this excess was literally poisoning the king's brain and making him violent and unpredictable. The treatment plan that these medical authorities came up with was so absurd and dangerous that it's amazing Charles VI survived it. First, they prescribed regular bloodletting, which involved cutting open the king's veins and draining significant amounts of blood from his body, because they believed this would reduce the pressure of bad humors in his system. The royal servants now had to assist with these procedures, which meant holding down their potentially violent king while doctors sliced him open with knives and collected his blood in bowls. Imagine trying to restrain someone who might suddenly decide you're an enemy and try to kill you, while also helping medical professionals deliberately weaken him by draining his blood. The doctors also insisted on a treatment called purging, which involved giving the king various herbs and concoctions designed to make him vomit violently and have explosive diarrhea, because they thought this would help expel the evil humors from his digestive system. The royal servants responsible for the king's personal care now had to clean up after these induced vomiting and diarrhea sessions, while also making sure that Charles VI didn't become violent during the process. They had to hold containers for him to throw up in, clean him when he soiled himself, change his bedding multiple times per day, and maintain some semblance of royal dignity while their employer was projectile vomiting and defecating uncontrollably as part of his medical treatment. Another brilliant medical intervention involved trepanation, which was the practice of drilling holes in the patient's skull to release pressure and allow evil spirits to escape from the brain. Several royal physicians seriously recommended this procedure for Charles VI, arguing that his violent behavior was caused by demons trapped inside his head, and the only way to cure him was to provide these evil spirits with an exit route. Fortunately for the king, and unfortunately for the servants who would have had to assist with this medieval brain surgery, the other doctors convinced them to try less invasive treatments first. The medical authorities also brought in specialists in herbal remedies, who prescribed complex mixtures of plants, animal parts, and mysterious substances that were supposed to restore the king's mental balance. These concoctions included ingredients like crushed pearls, powdered unicorn horn, which was actually narwhal tusk, dried bat wings, human urine from virgins, and ground-up Egyptian mummies. The servants had to locate these bizarre ingredients, prepare the mixtures according to precise instructions, and then convince their potentially homicidal king to consume these disgusting remedies multiple times per day. Some of the royal physicians decided that Charles VI's madness was caused by astrological influences, specifically an unfortunate alignment of planets that was affecting his brain chemistry. They created detailed charts showing how the positions of Mars and Saturn were interfering with the king's natural humoral balance, and they prescribed treatments that had to be timed according to lunar cycles and planetary movements. This meant that the servants had to keep track of complex astronomical calendars and adjust the king's daily routine based on the positions of celestial bodies. They might have to wake him up at 3 a.m. because the physicians determined that was the optimal time for his medication, or they might have to prevent him from eating certain foods during specific moon phases. The most frustrating aspect of dealing with these medical authorities was that none of their treatments actually worked, but instead of admitting that their theories were wrong, they kept coming up with increasingly elaborate explanations for why their methods weren't succeeding. When bloodletting didn't cure the king's madness, they decided he needed more bloodletting. When herbal remedies failed, they prescribed different herbs mixed with even more disgusting ingredients. When astrological treatments proved ineffective, they concluded that they had miscalculated the planetary influences and needed more complex astronomical observations. Just when the royal servants thought they had seen the worst of Charles VI's mental illness, and just when they were starting to develop strategies for managing his violent episodes, the king's condition took a turn toward something so bizarre and absurd that it defied all logic and imagination. About 6 months after the Forest of Le Mans incident, Charles VI developed what historians now call the glass delusion, and this wasn't just a minor eccentricity or a passing phase. This was a complete, all-consuming belief that his entire body was made of fragile glass that could shatter at any moment. The first sign that something new and terrible was happening occurred during a routine morning when the king's personal servants entered his chambers to help him get dressed for the day. Instead of finding him ready for his royal duties, they discovered Charles VI sitting perfectly still in the middle of his bed, absolutely refusing to move a single muscle. When they asked what was wrong, he whispered to them in a terrified voice that he had realized during the night that his body was made of glass, and any sudden movement could cause him to break into thousands of pieces. At first, the servants assumed this was some kind of metaphor or poetic expression, because medieval nobles often spoke in elaborate symbolic language. But as Charles VI explained his condition in more detail, it became clear that he literally, genuinely believed that his flesh and bones had been transformed into delicate, transparent glass. He claimed that he could feel the fragility of his glass skin, that he could sense how thin and breakable his glass bones had become, and that he was terrified of what would happen if he accidentally cracked or shattered. The practical implications of this delusion were absolutely insane. Charles VI refused to allow anyone to touch him, because human contact might cause his glass body to break. This meant that his personal servants, whose entire job was to help him bathe, dress, eat, and perform basic daily functions, suddenly couldn't do any of these things without risking what the king believed would be his literal destruction. They had to figure out how to help him get dressed without making physical contact, which was basically impossible. They tried using long sticks to move his clothes around, but the king was terrified that even slight vibrations from the sticks touching his garments would crack his glass skin. The king also became convinced that loud noises could shatter his glass body, so everyone in the royal court had to speak in whispers and walk on their tiptoes to avoid creating sound waves that might destroy their employer. The servants had to remove their shoes and wear soft slippers so their footsteps wouldn't create vibrations. They had to communicate through subtle hand gestures instead of speaking aloud. They had to move furniture extremely carefully to avoid making any scraping or bumping sounds. The entire royal household had to be redesigned around the king's glass delusion. His servants developed an elaborate system of pulleys and ropes that allowed them to move objects around the king's chambers without making noise or vibrations. They created specially padded surfaces for everything the king might come into contact with, hoping to convince him that these soft materials would protect his glass body from breaking. They even brought in musicians who could play extremely quiet, gentle music that supposedly wouldn't create dangerous sound vibrations. Charles VI's fear of breaking became so extreme that he refused to leave his bed for weeks at a time, convinced that standing up or walking would put too much stress on his glass legs and cause them to snap. His servants had to bring all his meals to his bedside, but they also had to figure out how to help him eat without touching him. They tried creating long-handled spoons and forks that would allow him to feed himself from a distance, but the king was afraid that chewing would cause his glass teeth to crack, so he would only eat soft foods that required minimal jaw movement. The glass delusion also affected Charles VI's personal hygiene in ways that were absolutely disgusting and challenging for his servants. He refused to bathe because he believed that water temperature changes could cause his glass body to expand and contract, leading to cracks and breaks. He wouldn't allow his servants to wash his clothes because the process of cleaning and drying garments created too much movement and vibration. He was afraid to use the bathroom normally because he thought the physical strain might damage his fragile glass organs. This meant that the king's personal servants had to deal with a monarch who was becoming increasingly filthy and smelly, but they couldn't clean him without violating his delusion and sending him into panic attacks. They tried creating elaborate systems of gentle air circulation to reduce odors, and they experimented with very light dustings of perfumed powders that could be applied without direct contact. The most heartbreaking aspect of this situation was that Charles VI wasn't just pretending or being dramatic. He genuinely, completely believed that he was made of glass, and his terror was absolutely real. When servants accidentally made sudden movements or unexpected sounds, the king would scream in genuine fear, convinced that he was about to die from shattering. His delusion was so convincing to him that he would spend hours carefully examining his skin, looking for tiny cracks or signs of damage, and reporting his observations to his servants as if they were real medical conditions that required immediate attention. The glass delusion didn't just make Charles VI's personal life incredibly difficult, it created a cascade of completely unexpected consequences that turned the entire French government into an elaborate theater production where everyone had to pretend their king was functional while secretly running the country around his bizarre limitations. Think about this logically for a moment. The King of France was the head of the entire government, the military, the judicial system, and the economic structure of one of Europe's most powerful nations. Every major decision, every law, every diplomatic agreement, every military campaign had to be approved by the king. But now the king was convinced he was made of glass and couldn't leave his bed or interact with other human beings. How do you run a country under those circumstances? The royal servants found themselves in the impossible position of having to maintain the illusion that Charles VI was still actively governing France, while actually making all the decisions themselves or finding ways to get other nobles to make choices without admitting that the king was completely incapacitated. They developed an incredibly complex system of communication that allowed them to get the king's approval for government decisions without actually involving him in the decision-making process. They would whisper questions to him from across the room, phrase issues in ways that only required simple yes or no answers, and sometimes just make decisions on his behalf and then convince him later that he had already approved them. The servants responsible for managing the king's correspondence faced particularly challenging problems. Foreign ambassadors, military commanders, and local governors were constantly sending messages that required immediate royal responses, but Charles VI couldn't handle the stress of reading documents or the physical activity of writing replies. His secretaries had to learn to forge the king's signature convincingly, and they developed techniques for writing letters that sounded like they came from Charles VI without actually involving him in the composition process. They would study his previous correspondence to mimic his writing style, and they would create responses that addressed important issues while avoiding anything too complex or decisive that might expose the king's mental condition. Court ceremonies and public appearances became absolutely nightmarish logistical challenges. Medieval kings were expected to regularly hold court, meet with nobles, participate in religious services, and make public appearances to demonstrate their authority and connection to their subjects. But Charles VI couldn't tolerate being touched, couldn't handle loud noises, and was terrified of breaking his glass body through any kind of physical activity. His servants had to create elaborate staging for these events that would allow the king to appear publicly while accommodating his delusions. They designed special chairs and platforms that would support him without direct contact. They arranged for all participants to communicate in whispers, and they developed scripts for ceremonies that could be completed with minimal royal participation. The economic consequences of having a non-functional king were absolutely devastating for the royal household and the entire kingdom. Charles VI couldn't sign financial documents, couldn't make decisions about taxation, couldn't approve payments to military forces, and couldn't negotiate trade agreements. His servants found themselves essentially embezzling from the royal treasury out of necessity, taking money to pay essential government expenses while forging the king's authorization for these expenditures. They had to maintain detailed secret records of all their financial decisions, hoping that if Charles VI ever recovered his sanity, they would be able to explain and justify everything they had done in his name. The psychological toll on the royal servants was enormous and completely unprecedented. These people had signed up to work for a king, not to secretly run a government while managing a mentally ill employer who might become violent without warning. They were constantly exhausted from the stress of making life-and-death decisions for an entire nation while pretending they were just following orders from their glass-bodied king. Many of them developed their own mental health problems from the chronic anxiety and impossible responsibilities they faced every day. Some servants quit and fled the court, risking charges of treason rather than continuing to deal with this insane situation. Others became alcoholics or developed nervous disorders from the constant tension. The most dedicated servants found themselves trapped in a situation where they couldn't leave because they were the only people who understood the complex systems they had created to keep the kingdom functioning, but they also couldn't continue indefinitely without completely breaking down. One of the most unexpected consequences was that Charles VI's glass delusion actually made some aspects of governance more efficient in bizarre ways. Because the servants couldn't involve the king in complex political discussions or time-consuming debates, they were forced to make quick, decisive choices about issues that might have been debated for months under normal circumstances. Some problems that had been lingering unresolved for years were suddenly addressed by servants who didn't have the luxury of endless deliberation. Foreign diplomats sometimes found that dealing with the king's representatives was actually more productive than trying to negotiate with royal courts where the monarch wanted to personally micromanage every detail. However, this efficiency came at the cost of legitimacy and long-term stability. The servants were making decisions that should have come from the king, but they had no legal authority to make these choices, and their actions could be challenged or reversed at any time. They were essentially governing France through an elaborate fraud, hoping that nobody would discover their deception and that Charles VI would eventually recover enough to retroactively approve everything they had done in his name. Just when the royal servants thought they had developed systems for managing Charles VI's glass delusion, and just when they were starting to feel like they could predict and control his bizarre behavior, the king's mental illness took another turn that was somehow even more disturbing and impossible to handle than anything they had experienced before. About 8 months after the glass obsession began, Charles VI woke up one morning and had absolutely no idea who he was, where he was, or why he was surrounded by all these strange people who kept calling him Your Majesty and treating him like royalty. This wasn't a case of temporary confusion or selective memory loss. The King of France had completely forgotten his own identity and was convinced that everyone around him was participating in some kind of elaborate hoax or conspiracy. When his personal servants entered his chambers that morning to help him prepare for the day, Charles VI looked at them with genuine confusion and fear, demanding to know who they were and why they were in his room. When they addressed him as Your Majesty and explained that they were his loyal servants, he laughed and told them they were obviously mistaken because he wasn't a king, he had never been a king, and he had no idea why they were pretending otherwise. He insisted that his name was not Charles VI, that he didn't live in a palace, and that he wanted to go home to his real family, whoever they were. The servants tried showing him mirrors, hoping that seeing his own reflection would help him recognize himself, but Charles VI just stared at the person looking back at him and claimed it was a stranger. They brought him royal portraits that had been painted of him just a few years earlier, but he examined these images and insisted they depicted someone else entirely. They tried to jog his memory by reminding him of important events from his reign, battles he had fought, ceremonies he had participated in, and personal experiences that only he would remember, but he responded to all of these stories as if they were tales about a completely different person. When Queen Isabeau, his wife of over 15 years and the mother of his children, came to visit him, Charles VI treated her like a complete stranger. He was polite but distant, addressing her formally as if meeting her for the first time, and he seemed genuinely confused about why this unknown woman was so emotional and upset when she spoke to him. When she tried to embrace him, he backed away and asked her to explain who she was and why she felt entitled to such intimate physical contact. The Queen broke down crying, but Charles VI just watched her tears with puzzled concern, like a kind stranger witnessing someone else's personal tragedy. The situation became even more heartbreaking when his children were brought to see him. Charles VI had several sons and daughters, ranging from young children to teenagers, and these kids were desperately hoping that seeing them would somehow restore their father's memory and bring him back to normal. But when they ran to hug him and called him Papa, Charles VI gently but firmly pushed them away and explained that they must be confused because he didn't have any children and had never seen them before in his life. He treated them with the same polite distance he showed to all the other strangers who claimed to know him, offering them candy and asking about their parents as if he were a friendly adult meeting random children at a social gathering. His servants found themselves in an impossible situation because they had to continue performing their duties while their employer insisted they were all participants in some kind of massive deception. Charles VI would become frustrated and sometimes angry when people refused to drop what he saw as their ridiculous pretense that he was the King of France. He would demand explanations for why everyone was lying to him, why they were keeping him in this strange palace against his will, and when they were going to let him return to his real life. He started requesting simple peasant clothes because he felt uncomfortable wearing the elaborate royal garments that obviously belonged to someone else, and he wanted simple food instead of the fancy royal cuisine that seemed inappropriate for someone of his clearly humble social status. The servants had to make incredibly delicate decisions about how to respond to these requests. If they continued to treat him like a king against his wishes, he would become agitated and distressed. But if they accommodated his belief that he was a common person, they would be abandoning their royal duties and potentially committing treason. They developed a compromise approach where they would provide him with simpler clothes and food while still maintaining basic royal protocol, hoping to keep him comfortable without completely abandoning their responsibilities to the crown. Managing Charles VI's daily routine became even more complicated because he refused to participate in royal ceremonies or government functions that he saw as elaborate charades designed to make him pretend to be someone else. He wouldn't sign documents because he insisted the signature wouldn't be legally valid since he wasn't actually the king. He refused to hold court or meet with nobles because he felt like he would be impersonating royalty, which seemed both dishonest and potentially dangerous. He declined to participate in religious services at the royal chapel because he didn't feel worthy of the special treatment that was apparently reserved for the real King Charles VI, whoever that person was. The royal servants working for Charles VI were now facing psychological and moral dilemmas that were completely unprecedented in human history, and these internal conflicts were tearing them apart in ways that were just as devastating as the king's mental illness itself. Imagine being in their position. You've sworn sacred oaths of loyalty to serve and protect your king, but your king is now a completely different person who doesn't remember being king and actively rejects everything that defines his royal identity. Do you continue following your original oaths to Charles VI the king, or do you respect the wishes of Charles VI the confused man who just wants to be left alone? Every single decision they made created impossible moral contradictions that had no right answers. The servants who were most loyal to the original Charles VI, the ones who had served him faithfully before his mental breakdown, felt like they were betraying him by accommodating his delusions and allowing him to abandon his royal responsibilities. These devoted employees believed that the real king was trapped somewhere inside his confused mind, and their job was to keep his kingdom running until he recovered and returned to normal. They continued to address him as Your Majesty, maintained royal protocol around him, and made decisions in his name because they felt this was what he would have wanted them to do if he had been mentally healthy. But this approach often caused Charles VI to become distressed and agitated because he genuinely didn't understand why people kept treating him like royalty against his wishes. Other servants took the opposite approach, believing that their primary duty was to the human being in front of them, regardless of his mental state or royal identity. These compassionate employees focused on keeping Charles VI as comfortable and happy as possible, which meant treating him like the common person he believed himself to be and respecting his desire to live a simple, non-royal lifestyle. They would bring him peasant clothes when he requested them, serve him simple food, and speak to him as an equal rather than as subjects addressing their monarch. But this approach felt like abandoning their sacred oaths and responsibilities to the crown, and it created practical problems because they still needed someone to make royal decisions for the kingdom. The most conflicted servants were the ones who had developed genuine personal relationships with Charles VI before his illness, people who had worked closely with him for years and considered themselves not just employees but friends. These individuals were watching someone they cared about suffer from a condition they couldn't understand or fix, and they were torn between wanting to help the person he had become and wanting to restore the person he used to be. They knew intimate details about his personality, his preferences, his fears and hopes from before the mental breakdown, and they could see how different he had become. Some of these servants reported having dreams where the old Charles VI would visit them and beg them to keep fighting for his recovery, while others had nightmares where the confused current version of the king would accuse them of keeping him prisoner and demanding his freedom. The financial and legal conflicts were just as agonizing as the emotional ones. The royal treasury was running low because Charles VI couldn't authorize new taxation or approve government expenditures, but the servants knew that the kingdom needed funding for essential services, military operations and basic government functions. They were faced with the choice of either allowing France to collapse into economic chaos, or essentially committing embezzlement by taking money without proper royal authorization. Some servants justified their financial decisions by arguing that they were acting in the king's best interests and that he would approve their actions if he were mentally capable of understanding the situation. Others felt like they were stealing from their employer and worried that they would face severe punishment if Charles VI ever recovered and discovered what they had done with his money. The religious conflicts were particularly intense because medieval servants took their spiritual obligations very seriously, and many of them believed that Charles VI's condition was either a test from God or a punishment for some unknown sin. Some servants thought they were failing a divine test by not finding a way to cure their king's madness, and they spent hours praying for guidance or wisdom that never seemed to come. Others worried that by making decisions on behalf of an incapacitated king, they were interfering with God's plan and would face eternal punishment for overstepping their divinely appointed roles. A few servants became convinced that Charles VI's illness was a sign that God wanted them to take more active leadership roles, but then they felt guilty for what seemed like prideful thoughts about seeking power. The servants also struggled with conflicting loyalties between Charles VI and other members of the royal family. Queen Isabeau was desperate to have her husband restored to normal, and she often pressured the servants to try more aggressive treatments or to force Charles VI to participate in royal duties whether he wanted to or not. The royal children needed their father to be present and functional, and they would beg the servants to find ways to make him remember who he was. But Charles VI himself seemed happier and more peaceful when people stopped trying to convince him he was someone else and just let him live as the person he believed himself to be. The servants had to choose between making the king's family happy or making the king himself comfortable, and there was no way to satisfy both groups simultaneously. Faced with a king who thought he was made of glass and didn't remember being royalty, the medieval medical authorities decided that what this situation really needed was more creative and elaborate treatments that would make their previous interventions look rational by comparison. If you thought bloodletting and herbal remedies were the worst ideas these doctors could come up with, you were incredibly wrong, because they were just getting started with their medical innovation. The royal physicians held a series of consultations where they brought together the most respected medical minds in France, along with religious leaders, astrologers, and various other experts who claimed to understand the mysterious workings of the human mind. This collection of medieval intellectuals examined Charles VI's symptoms and came to the conclusion that his condition was clearly the result of multiple supernatural forces working together in an unprecedented combination of magical attacks. They determined that the king had been simultaneously cursed by witches, possessed by demons, affected by evil planetary alignments, and poisoned by invisible vapors that were corrupting his blood and brain. Obviously, such a complex supernatural medical emergency required equally complex supernatural treatments that would address all of these different causes at the same time. The first brilliant solution they developed was something called sympathetic magic therapy, which was based on the theory that you could cure someone's illness by performing symbolic actions that represented the opposite of their symptoms. Since Charles VI believed he was made of fragile glass, the doctors decided to surround him with objects that symbolized strength and durability. His servants were ordered to fill his chambers with iron tools, stone sculptures, thick wooden furniture, and other items that represented unbreakable materials. The idea was that by constantly seeing and being near these sturdy objects, the king's mind would somehow absorb their symbolic strength and stop believing he was fragile. The servants had to completely redecorate the royal chambers with heavy, masculine objects while still being careful not to create vibrations or loud noises that might upset the king's glass delusion. They spent weeks hauling massive stone blocks and iron anvils into his bedroom, trying to arrange these items in aesthetically pleasing ways that would provide symbolic healing energy without making the room look like a blacksmith's workshop. Another innovative treatment involved memory restoration ceremonies that were designed to shock Charles VI back into remembering his royal identity. The doctors theorized that his amnesia was caused by evil spirits who had stolen his memories and hidden them in a supernatural realm, and the only way to retrieve these lost memories was through elaborate theatrical performances that would recreate important moments from his life in such vivid detail that the memories would be forced to return to his mind. The royal servants were required to participate in these bizarre reenactment ceremonies, playing the roles of various people from the king's past and acting out scenes from his childhood, his coronation, his wedding, and other significant events. They had to study historical records and interview people who had been present at these occasions, learning dialogue and staging elaborate productions that were supposed to trigger Charles VI's memory recovery. The king would be brought to watch these performances, while doctors observed his reactions and looked for signs of recognition or mental breakthrough. Unfortunately, Charles VI usually just enjoyed these shows as entertainment, complimenting the servants on their acting skills and asking if there would be more performances tomorrow, without showing any signs of remembering that the events depicted had actually happened to him. The medical authorities also developed a treatment called graduated identity reintroduction, which involved slowly convincing Charles VI that he was royalty by starting with small claims and gradually building up to larger ones. The plan was to begin by telling him that he was a minor nobleman, then upgrade him to a duke, then to a prince, and eventually work their way up to convincing him that he was the king of France. The servants were given detailed scripts for these conversations and were required to practice their lines until they could deliver them convincingly. They would spend hours each day having carefully orchestrated discussions with Charles VI, trying to plant suggestions about his noble heritage and gradually increase his sense of social importance. This process was incredibly frustrating for everyone involved because Charles VI would sometimes seem to accept small claims about being minor nobility, but then he would forget these conversations entirely by the next day and they would have to start over from the beginning. One particularly creative physician suggested that Charles VI's glass delusion could be cured through controlled breaking therapy, which involved deliberately creating small, harmless breaking sounds near the king to prove to him that he wasn't actually made of glass. The theory was that if Charles VI could hear glass objects breaking around him without feeling any damage to his own body, he would logically conclude that he must not be made of glass himself. The servants were instructed to periodically drop small glass items like cups or decorative objects in the king's presence, while carefully observing his reactions and ready to explain that since he hadn't been harmed by these breaking sounds, he must not be made of glass. This treatment backfired spectacularly because the sound of breaking glass terrified Charles VI and convinced him that he was in constant danger of suffering the same fate as these destroyed objects. The servants found themselves cleaning up broken glass while trying to comfort a hysterical king who was now even more convinced that his glass body was fragile and vulnerable. The doctors also prescribed royal essence restoration, which involved feeding Charles VI foods and drinks that had been specially prepared with ingredients that were supposed to represent royal power and authority. These meals included gold flakes mixed into his wine, because gold was the most royal of metals and would supposedly restore his monarchical identity. They served him dishes made with rare and expensive ingredients that only kings could afford, hoping that consuming these luxury foods would remind his body and mind of his royal status. The servants had to source these bizarre ingredients and prepare meals according to complex recipes that were more like alchemical formulas than normal cooking instructions. Despite all the elaborate medical treatments and careful management strategies that the royal servants had developed, there was one incident that proved beyond any doubt that Charles VI was not just eccentric or confused, but genuinely dangerous in ways that could not be predicted or controlled. This event was so shocking and violent that even the most loyal servants began to question whether they could continue working for someone who might kill them without warning, and it involved a French nobleman named Pierre de Craon who made the fatal mistake of visiting the royal court at exactly the wrong moment. Pierre de Craon was a respected member of the French nobility, a man who had served the crown faithfully for years and had absolutely no reason to expect that a routine visit to the palace would nearly cost him his life. He had come to court to discuss some minor administrative matters with the king, the kind of boring bureaucratic business that happened dozens of times every week without incident. Pierre had met with Charles VI many times before during periods when the king seemed relatively stable, and he had been briefed by the royal servants about the king's current mental condition. But nobody had warned him about what was about to happen because nobody could have predicted it. The attack occurred during what seemed like a perfectly normal afternoon in the royal throne room. Charles VI was having one of his better days, sitting upright in his chair, engaging in polite conversation, and showing no obvious signs of distress or agitation. He had been discussing policy matters with several advisors, and his responses seemed coherent and appropriate to the topics being discussed. The royal servants who were present felt cautiously optimistic that this might be the beginning of another period of mental clarity, and they were relieved to see their king behaving like the ruler he used to be. Pierre de Craon was announced and entered the throne room according to proper protocol, bowing respectfully and approaching the king to present his business. Charles VI acknowledged him politely and seemed to recognize him as a familiar court member. They began discussing the administrative issues that Pierre had come to address, and the conversation proceeded normally for several minutes. The king asked appropriate questions, made reasonable comments, and appeared to be fully engaged with the subject matter. Everyone in the room was relaxed and focused on the business at hand, with no sense that anything unusual was about to occur. Then, without any warning, without any change in his facial expression or tone of voice, Charles VI suddenly stood up from his throne and drew the ceremonial sword that he always wore as part of his royal regalia. In one smooth, lightning-fast motion, he raised the weapon and brought it down toward Pierre de Craon's head with the clear intention of splitting his skull in half. The only thing that saved Pierre's life was his quick reflexes and the fact that several royal guards were standing close enough to intervene. Pierre threw himself to the side just as the sword whistled through the air where his head had been a split second earlier, and the guards immediately rushed forward to restrain the king before he could make a second attack. The scene that followed was absolute chaos. Charles VI was struggling violently against the guards, screaming that Pierre de Craon was a traitor and a spy who had come to assassinate him, even though there was absolutely no evidence to support these accusations and Pierre had been discussing completely mundane administrative matters just moments before. The king was fighting with superhuman strength, trying to break free so he could finish killing the man he was now convinced was his mortal enemy. Pierre de Craon was on the floor, bleeding from minor cuts where the sword had grazed him during his desperate escape, staring up at the king with absolute terror and complete confusion about why he was suddenly being attacked by someone he had served loyally for years. The royal servants and guards were trying to disarm Charles VI without hurting him, which was incredibly difficult because he was wielding a sharp weapon and seemed determined to commit murder. They had to treat him with the respect due to a king while also protecting an innocent man from being killed by that same king. Several courtiers were shouting contradictory orders, some telling the guards to restrain Charles VI more forcefully, others insisting that they couldn't use violence against the royal person even to prevent him from committing murder. The most disturbing aspect of this attack was how suddenly and unpredictably it had occurred. Charles VI had been completely normal just seconds before he tried to kill Pierre de Craon, and immediately after the guards disarmed him, he seemed confused about why everyone was so upset and claimed he had no memory of drawing his sword or attacking anyone. He looked at Pierre de Craon's injuries and appeared genuinely concerned about the wounded man's welfare, asking how he had been hurt and whether he needed medical attention. When they told him that he had just tried to kill Pierre with his sword, Charles VI insisted they were lying because he would never hurt such a loyal servant of the crown. The king's complete lack of memory about his violent behavior made this incident even more terrifying for everyone who witnessed it, because it proved that Charles VI could become homicidal without warning, without apparent reason, and without any recollection of his actions afterward. This meant that the royal servants could never predict when he might become dangerous, and they could never use his past behavior to anticipate future violence. Any interaction with the king, no matter how routine or pleasant it seemed, could suddenly turn deadly without any way to prevent or prepare for the attack. The terrifying reality that the French royal servants had to face was that Charles VI was not some unique historical anomaly, but rather part of a disturbing pattern of mentally unstable rulers who had plagued European history for centuries. In fact, if you were unlucky enough to work as a royal servant at various points throughout medieval and early modern history, there was a surprisingly high chance that you would end up dealing with a completely insane boss who might decide to kill you for reasons that existed only in their diseased mind. Let's take a trip through some of the other royal employers that no sane person would ever want to work for, starting with the Roman Emperor Caligula, who ruled from 37 to 41 AD and made Charles VI look almost reasonable by comparison. Caligula's servants had to deal with an emperor who insisted on having sexual relationships with his own sisters, appointed his favorite horse as a consul of Rome, and once declared war on the sea itself, ordering his soldiers to march to the beach and stab the waves with their swords while collecting seashells as spoils of war. Imagine being the servant responsible for explaining to foreign ambassadors why the Emperor of Rome was having a formal political conversation with a horse, or being the poor military aide who had to relay Caligula's command that the entire Roman army should attack the ocean. Caligula also enjoyed forcing senators to run alongside his chariot for miles until they collapsed from exhaustion, and his servants had to organize these humiliating spectacles while pretending they were normal imperial activities rather than the sadistic games of a madman. The emperor would randomly order executions during dinner parties, sometimes deciding to kill guests simply because he didn't like their facial expressions, and his servants had to maintain the pretense that these murders were justified political decisions rather than the whims of a psychotic dictator. Moving forward in history, we encounter Ivan the Terrible of Russia, whose servants faced challenges that were remarkably similar to those experienced by Charles VI's staff. Ivan ruled from 1547 to 1584, and during his reign, his mental condition deteriorated to the point where he would fly into violent rages that could last for days, during which he would order the torture and execution of anyone who happened to be nearby, including his own most loyal advisors and servants. Ivan's staff had to develop elaborate early warning systems to detect when the Tsar was entering one of his psychotic episodes, and they would quietly evacuate the palace of anyone who might accidentally trigger his violence. Like Charles VI, Ivan would sometimes have periods of apparent sanity followed by sudden explosions of irrational fury, which meant his servants could never predict when their workplace would become a death trap. Ivan also shared Charles VI's tendency to forget his violent actions and then become confused or angry when people tried to remind him of what he had done. The servants working for Ivan had to maintain detailed secret records of his crimes while publicly pretending that all of his actions were justified acts of royal justice. One of the most disturbing parallels between Ivan and Charles VI was their treatment of family members. Ivan famously killed his own son during a violent rage, just as Charles VI would sometimes attack his wife and children during his psychotic episodes. In England, King Henry VI, who ruled during the same general time period as Charles VI, experienced mental breakdowns that were so severe his servants essentially had to run the entire kingdom while pretending their king was functional. Henry VI would spend months in a catatonic state, sitting motionless and unresponsive while his servants fed him, cleaned him, and moved his body to prevent bedsores. Unlike Charles VI's active delusions, Henry VI's mental illness manifested as complete withdrawal from reality, but the practical challenges for his servants were remarkably similar. They had to make royal decisions without royal authorization, forge official documents, and maintain the illusion of royal authority while their actual employer was essentially a living statue. The servants working for these various mad kings developed surprisingly similar strategies for survival and kingdom management across different centuries and countries. They all learned to work in groups rather than alone, to maintain secret communication networks for sharing information about the king's mental state, and to develop coded languages that allowed them to warn each other about potential danger without alerting their unstable employer. They all became expert forgers, learning to mimic royal handwriting and signatures to authorize essential government business. They all struggled with the same moral dilemmas about whether their primary loyalty should be to the person their king used to be, the person he currently was, or the kingdom he was supposed to be governing. Perhaps most importantly, the servants of all these mad rulers learned that mental illness in positions of absolute power creates unique forms of trauma and moral injury that don't exist in any other type of employment. These people weren't just dealing with difficult bosses or workplace stress. They were trying to maintain their own sanity and moral compass while serving employers who had lost both of these things entirely. They had to find ways to remain human and compassionate while working in environments where violence, cruelty, and irrationality were daily realities. The historical record shows that many royal servants who worked for mentally ill rulers eventually developed their own psychological problems, including what we would now recognize as symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and anxiety. Some became alcoholics, others had nervous breakdowns, and quite a few simply disappeared from historical records entirely, presumably fleeing their positions rather than continuing to endure the psychological torture of serving a mad king. Just when you thought Charles VI's mental illness couldn't possibly get any worse, just when you thought his servants had already endured every form of royal insanity imaginable, the King of France descended into a level of complete behavioral collapse that was so disgusting, so disturbing, and so absolutely inhuman that it defied all understanding of what a person could become while still technically being alive. What happened during the final stages of Charles VI's mental deterioration was so shocking that some of the historical accounts were considered too graphic to be included in official records, and the servants who witnessed these events were sworn to secrecy about details that were deemed too horrifying for public knowledge. The first sign that Charles VI was entering his final descent into complete madness occurred when he suddenly decided that bathing was dangerous and refused to allow water to touch his body under any circumstances. This wasn't just a preference for staying dirty or a temporary aversion to cleanliness. This was an absolute, terrified conviction that water would somehow destroy him, either by dissolving his glass body or by allowing evil spirits to enter through his pores. His servants watched in horror as their king, who had once been fastidious about his appearance and personal hygiene, transformed into a filthy, stinking creature who looked more like a wild animal than the ruler of France. Charles VI would scream and fight violently if anyone attempted to bring water near him, even for drinking, and he would hide in corners of his room whenever he heard the sound of servants drawing baths for other members of the royal household. The smell that emanated from the king's unwashed body became so overwhelming that people could detect his presence from several rooms away, and his servants had to burn incense constantly just to make his chambers bearable for the few minutes they needed to spend near him each day. They tried every possible method to convince him to bathe, including bringing in priests to explain that cleanliness was godly, hiring entertainers to make bathing seem fun and amusing, and even attempting to clean him while he slept, but nothing worked because his phobia of water had become absolute and unshakable. Even more disturbing than his refusal to bathe was Charles VI's complete abandonment of basic toilet habits and human dignity. The king began urinating and defecating in his royal garments, sometimes while sitting on his throne during official ceremonies, without showing any awareness or concern about what he was doing. His servants would watch in mortified silence as the King of France would relieve himself during important meetings with foreign ambassadors, soiling his expensive royal robes while discussing matters of state as if nothing unusual was happening. The servants responsible for cleaning up after these incidents faced the most degrading and psychologically damaging work imaginable. They had to maintain their respectful demeanor while changing the soiled clothing of a grown man who was completely indifferent to his own filthiness and would sometimes smear his own waste on the walls and furniture of his chambers like a deranged animal. The king's servants also had to develop strategies for managing his bowel movements during public appearances, which involved secretly positioning themselves with cleaning supplies and spare clothing, ready to quickly address any accidents while maintaining the illusion that everything was proceeding normally. But perhaps the most traumatic and disturbing behavior that Charles VI's servants had to witness and manage was his tendency to strip off all his clothes and run naked through the palace, howling like a wild animal and attacking anyone who tried to stop him. These naked rampage episodes could happen at any time, during formal ceremonies in the middle of the night, or while foreign dignitaries were visiting the court. The servants would suddenly hear inhuman screaming and howling coming from the king's chambers, and they would know that Charles VI had stripped naked and was about to go tearing through the palace corridors like a rabid beast. They developed emergency protocols for these situations, stationing guards at strategic locations and keeping blankets and restraints readily available, but catching and covering a naked, screaming, violent king without hurting him or allowing him to hurt others required incredible skill and coordination. During these episodes, Charles VI seemed to lose all human characteristics except for his physical form. He would run on all fours like an animal, make sounds that resembled barking or howling more than human speech, and try to bite or scratch anyone who came near him. His eyes would become completely wild and unfocused, and he seemed to have no recognition of his surroundings or the people around him. The servants who had to restrain him during these episodes reported that it was like trying to capture a dangerous wild animal that happened to look human, and many of them were injured by his claws and teeth during the process. The psychological impact on the servants who witnessed these naked rampage episodes was devastating and long-lasting. Many of them reported having nightmares about their king's inhuman behavior, and some developed their own mental health problems from the trauma of repeatedly seeing their sovereign reduced to such an animalistic state. They had to continue performing their royal duties and maintaining proper respect for their monarch, even after watching him behave in ways that stripped away every vestige of human dignity and royal authority. The servants also faced the impossible task of explaining Charles VI's naked episodes to other members of the royal household and visiting dignitaries without admitting that their king had completely lost his humanity. They developed elaborate cover stories about the king having private religious rituals, or medical treatments, that required seclusion, and they would frantically clean up any evidence of his animal-like behavior before allowing anyone else into the affected areas of the palace. The most heartbreaking aspect of these final stages of Charles VI's mental illness was that he would sometimes have brief moments of apparent clarity where he seemed to realize what had happened to him. He would look around at his filthy clothes, smell his own stench, and ask his servants why he was so dirty and why everyone looked so frightened and disgusted when they were near him. But these moments of awareness were fleeting, and within minutes he would forget his questions and return to his delusional state, leaving his servants to wonder whether these brief glimpses of sanity made his condition more tragic or more unbearable to witness. By the time Charles VI had completely descended into his final animalistic state, the carefully constructed web of lies and cover-ups that his servants had maintained for over 20 years was beginning to unravel in spectacular fashion, and the French people were starting to realize that their kingdom had been secretly governed by servants while their actual king had been completely insane for decades. The truth about Charles VI's condition couldn't be hidden forever, especially when the smell from the royal palace had become so overwhelming that people living in nearby neighborhoods complained about the stench, and when foreign ambassadors started reporting back to their own countries that something was seriously wrong with the French monarchy. The initial reaction from the French population was a mixture of disbelief, horror, and rage that created the perfect conditions for complete social chaos and potential civil war. When rumors about the king's true condition began spreading through Paris and the surrounding regions, most people's first response was to assume that these stories were enemy propaganda designed to weaken France's reputation and encourage rebellions or foreign invasions. The idea that their divinely appointed king, the man they had been taught to revere as God's chosen representative on earth, could be running around naked, eating his own waste, and behaving like a rabid animal was so fundamentally incomprehensible that many French citizens simply refused to believe it was possible. They had been told for years that Charles VI was suffering from a minor illness that occasionally required him to rest and recover, and they had accepted this explanation because the alternative was too terrifying to contemplate. But as more and more details leaked out from palace servants who could no longer maintain the pretense, and as independent witnesses confirmed the most disturbing aspects of the king's behavior, the French people were forced to confront the horrifying reality that their entire government had been built on a massive lie for over 2 decades. The psychological impact of this revelation on the general population was absolutely devastating. Medieval people's entire understanding of political legitimacy, social order, and divine authority was based on the belief that kings were chosen by God and possessed special qualities that made them suitable for absolute rule. If the King of France was actually a drooling, naked madman who couldn't control his bodily functions, what did that say about God's judgment? What did it mean for the entire concept of monarchy? How could they trust any authority figures ever again if the ultimate authority figure had been completely fake for their entire adult lives? Some French citizens responded to this crisis of faith by deciding that Charles VI's madness was actually a test from God, and that the French people had failed this test by not recognizing the signs earlier and taking action to help their king. These religiously minded individuals organized prayer groups, pilgrimages, and elaborate religious ceremonies designed to ask for God's forgiveness and Charles VI's miraculous healing. They believed that if they could demonstrate sufficient devotion and repentance, God would restore their king's sanity and return France to its proper divine order. Other citizens reached the opposite conclusion, deciding that Charles VI's insanity was proof that God had abandoned France entirely, and that the only way to restore divine favor was to remove the mad king from power and replace him with someone who was actually capable of rational thought and moral behavior. These people began organizing political movements aimed at forcing Charles VI to abdicate in favor of one of his sons or other relatives, and they demanded that the servants who had been secretly running the government be held accountable for their deception and unauthorized exercise of royal authority. The economic consequences of the truth about Charles VI's condition were immediate and catastrophic. Foreign merchants who had been conducting business with France suddenly became nervous about the stability and reliability of French contracts and agreements, since these documents had apparently been signed by mentally incompetent servants rather than by the actual king. Some international trade partnerships were cancelled entirely, while others demanded additional guarantees and higher interest rates to compensate for the increased risk of dealing with a government that had been operating under false pretenses for decades. The value of French currency began to decline as foreign investors lost confidence in the kingdom's political stability, and many French businesses found themselves unable to obtain credit or secure international partnerships because their country's reputation had been so severely damaged. Military commanders throughout France faced a particularly complex crisis because they had been following orders that they believed came from the king, but which had actually been issued by unauthorized servants. Some generals decided that these orders had no legal validity and refused to continue following them, while others argued that the servants had been acting in the king's best interests and that their commands should be considered legitimate. This disagreement about military authority led to several cases where different units of the French army received contradictory orders and ended up fighting against each other, unsure of who had the right to command them and what their actual objectives should be. The French nobility were split into multiple factions with completely different ideas about how to respond to the crisis. Some aristocrats demanded immediate action to remove Charles VI from power and establish a regency government led by capable relatives. Others insisted that the king's condition was a temporary medical problem that would eventually be cured, and that removing him would be both illegal and immoral. A third group of nobles saw this crisis as an opportunity to increase their own power and influence, arguing that if the monarchy had proven itself unreliable, perhaps France needed a new system of government that gave more authority to the aristocratic class. The servants who had been secretly running France for decades suddenly found themselves in incredibly dangerous political positions. Some people wanted to execute them for treason, arguing that they had committed the ultimate crime by impersonating royal authority and making decisions that were legally reserved for the king. Others wanted to reward them for their loyalty and dedication, claiming that they had saved France from complete collapse by maintaining government functions during the king's incapacity. Many of the servants attempted to flee the country entirely, recognizing that regardless of which political faction gained power, they would probably be scapegoated for the kingdom's problems and face severe punishment for their role in the deception. The most tragic aspect of the population's reaction was how it affected the servants who had genuinely tried to do their best under impossible circumstances. These people had sacrificed their own mental health, moral comfort, and personal safety to keep France functioning during one of the most challenging periods in the kingdom's history. They had faced daily threats of violence from their insane employer while also taking responsibility for governing millions of people without any legal authority to do so. Many of them had developed serious psychological problems from the stress and trauma of their situation, and they had endured decades of moral anguish about whether their actions were justified or treasonous. But instead of being recognized for their sacrifice and dedication, they found themselves blamed for every problem that France had experienced during Charles VI's reign, and they were treated as criminals rather than heroes by a population that was looking for someone to punish for the deception they had endured. The reign of Charles VI didn't just end when he finally died in 1422, it created a legacy of political trauma, institutional distrust, and bizarre governmental practices that continued to haunt France for generations and fundamentally changed how European kingdoms thought about royal authority and mental fitness for rule. The consequences of having a completely insane king for over 30 years created ripple effects that influenced French politics, international relations, and royal succession laws for centuries afterward, and some of these changes were so strange and unprecedented that they became permanent features of European government that lasted well into the modern era. One of the most immediate and long-lasting impacts was the development of what historians call regency paranoia, which was an obsessive concern among European royal families that their own monarchs might secretly be mentally incompetent and that their governments might be operating under false pretenses without anyone realizing it. After the Charles VI scandal became widely known, royal courts throughout Europe began implementing elaborate surveillance systems designed to monitor their kings and queens for early signs of mental illness, and they developed complex protocols for secretly assessing royal mental capacity without alerting the monarch to what was happening. These systems involved networks of spies, doctors, and trusted advisors who would observe the ruler's behavior, test their decision-making abilities, and report any concerning symptoms to secret committees that could theoretically take action if the monarch became unfit for rule. The problem with these surveillance systems was that they created an atmosphere of constant suspicion and mistrust within royal courts, where kings and queens became paranoid that their own servants were watching them for signs of weakness, and where servants became terrified that any unusual behavior from their employers might be interpreted as evidence of mental illness and result in accusations of conspiracy or treason. Many European monarchs became so concerned about appearing mentally unstable that they began overcompensating by making increasingly dramatic and irrational decisions designed to prove their sanity and authority, which often had the opposite effect of making them seem more unbalanced than they actually were. The Charles VI legacy also led to the creation of formal royal competency evaluations that became standard practice in many European kingdoms, where potential heirs to the throne were subjected to psychological examinations and mental fitness tests before they could be officially recognized as legitimate successors. These evaluations were supposed to prevent another situation where a mentally incompetent person could inherit absolute power, but they also created new opportunities for political manipulation and corruption, as rival factions could use claims about mental unfitness to challenge the succession rights of their enemies. Some of these competency evaluations became elaborate theatrical performances where royal candidates had to demonstrate their sanity by solving complex puzzles, engaging in philosophical debates, or performing other tasks that were supposed to prove their mental capacity but which actually had very little relationship to the practical skills needed for effective governance. The institutional changes that resulted from the Charles VI crisis were even more significant than the individual psychological impacts. The French government developed new systems of checks and balances that were specifically designed to prevent unauthorized servants from making royal decisions, including requirements for multiple signatures on important documents, regular audits of royal finances, and oversight committees that could investigate suspicious governmental activities. These reforms were supposed to ensure transparency and accountability, but they also made the French government incredibly slow and bureaucratic, since every decision now required extensive verification and approval processes that could take months to complete. The slowness and inefficiency of this new governmental system put France at a severe disadvantage compared to other European kingdoms that could make quick decisions and respond rapidly to changing political situations. Perhaps the most bizarre long-term consequence of Charles VI's reign was the development of what became known as servant government, which was a shadow system of unofficial administrators who were trained to secretly take over governmental functions if the official rulers became incapacitated. These servant government networks were supposed to provide continuity and stability during royal mental health crises, but they also created parallel power structures that sometimes competed with or contradicted the official royal government. Some kingdoms ended up with two completely different sets of policies and decisions, one coming from the actual king and another coming from the servant government, and nobody was quite sure which set of orders should be considered legitimate. The international diplomatic consequences of the Charles VI scandal were equally strange and long-lasting. Foreign countries began demanding proof of royal mental competency before entering into treaties or agreements with other kingdoms, and some diplomatic negotiations included clauses that would void contracts if the signing monarch was later determined to have been mentally incompetent at the time of the agreement. This led to the development of international standards for assessing royal mental fitness, and some treaties required independent medical examinations of all participating rulers before the documents could be considered valid. The cultural and psychological impact on the French people created generational trauma that affected how they viewed authority, government, and social institutions for centuries. Many French families passed down stories about the Charles VI era as cautionary tales about the dangers of blind obedience to authority figures, and French popular culture developed a deep skepticism about royal claims and governmental promises that persisted long after the monarchy was eventually abolished. French literature, art, and folk stories from the centuries following Charles VI's death frequently featured themes of hidden madness, deceptive authority figures, and the heroic efforts of common people to maintain social order despite incompetent leadership. The legal precedents established during Charles VI's reign also had lasting impacts on European jurisprudence and constitutional law. The question of whether decisions made by unauthorized servants on behalf of an incompetent king should be considered legally valid became a major issue in legal scholarship, and different kingdoms developed different approaches to this problem that influenced their legal systems for centuries. Some countries decided that any action taken in the king's name should be considered legitimate regardless of who actually made the decision, while others ruled that only decisions made by mentally competent monarchs could have legal force. These different approaches to the problem of royal mental competency created inconsistencies in international law that occasionally led to conflicts and disputes between kingdoms that had different standards for evaluating the legitimacy of royal actions. So after learning about the absolute nightmare that was working for Charles VI, I think it's time we all take a moment to appreciate just how good we have it with our modern workplace problems, because even the worst boss you've ever had probably never tried to kill you with a sword or made you clean up their literal shit while they ran around naked screaming like an animal. Think about this for a second. You've probably complained about having a difficult manager, maybe someone who's unreasonable, demanding, or just generally unpleasant to work with, but I guarantee that your worst workplace horror story pales in comparison to having to whisper at work for months because your boss thinks loud noises will shatter his glass body. Your most annoying coworker has never forced you to participate in elaborate theatrical performances designed to help them remember their own name, and your most incompetent supervisor has never required you to forge their signature on important documents because they've forgotten how to write and also think they're made of crystal. Even the most toxic work environment you can imagine probably doesn't involve daily risk of being murdered by your employer during randomly triggered psychotic episodes, and I'm betting that even your most unreasonable deadline has never involved having to coordinate a cover-up of your boss's complete mental breakdown while secretly running an entire government without any legal authority to make decisions. Let's put this in modern perspective for a moment. Imagine if the CEO of your company suddenly decided that they were made of glass and couldn't leave their office or interact with anyone because human contact might break them. Imagine having to run board meetings by whispering questions through the door and then interpreting their confused responses as executive decisions that would affect thousands of employees and millions of dollars in business operations. Imagine having to explain to clients and investors that the CEO is temporarily unavailable due to a rare medical condition, while secretly making all the major corporate decisions yourself and hoping that nobody discovers that your company has been essentially leaderless for the past 2 years. Or picture this scenario. Your boss suddenly forgets who they are, insists they've never worked at your company, and demands to know why everyone keeps pretending they're in charge of anything. You'd have to continue treating them with professional respect while they refuse to participate in meetings because they think it would be fraud to impersonate the real CEO, and you'd have to find ways to get their approval for important decisions while they're convinced that signing documents would be forgery since they're obviously not the person whose name is on the signature line. Even our most frustrating modern workplace technologies and bureaucracies start to seem reasonable when compared to medieval royal employment. Sure, your company's HR department might be slow and inefficient, but at least they're not trying to cure your boss's mental illness by drilling holes in their skull or feeding them mixtures of crushed pearls and powdered unicorn horn. Your IT support might be incompetent, but they've probably never had to develop elaborate pulley systems to move objects around your boss's office without creating vibrations that might cause them to believe they're being shattered into pieces. Your company's dress code might be annoying, but it probably doesn't require you to wear special silent slippers and communicate exclusively through hand signals to avoid triggering your employer's delusions about being made of fragile glass. The medieval servants working for Charles VI also didn't have any of the legal protections and support systems that modern employees take for granted. There were no labor unions to file complaints with, no occupational safety regulations to protect workers from dangerous bosses, no employee assistance programs to help people cope with workplace trauma, and definitely no option to quit and find a different job if your current employer was literally trying to kill you. These servants were trapped in their positions by legal obligations, social expectations, and economic necessity, and they had to endure decades of psychological torture without any recourse or support. They couldn't call in sick when their boss was having particularly violent episodes, they couldn't request transfers to different departments, and they certainly couldn't file lawsuits for workplace harassment or unsafe working conditions. Modern employees also have the luxury of being able to complain about their jobs to friends, family, and co-workers without facing charges of treason or risking execution for criticizing their employer. The servants working for Charles VI had to keep their experiences completely secret, which meant they couldn't process their trauma through normal social support systems or seek advice from others about how to handle their impossible situation. They had to pretend that everything was normal while dealing with levels of stress and moral confusion that would drive most modern people to complete nervous breakdowns, and they had to maintain this pretense for decades without any acknowledgement of their sacrifice or recognition of their extraordinary dedication. But perhaps the most important difference between medieval and modern employment is that we now understand mental illness as a medical condition that requires treatment and support, rather than as a supernatural curse or divine punishment that can be cured through bloodletting and exorcism. If a modern CEO started showing signs of serious mental health problems, they would hopefully receive professional psychiatric care, medication, and therapy that could help them manage their condition and continue functioning in their role, or they would be encouraged to step down temporarily while they focused on recovery. The idea of allowing someone with severe untreated mental illness to maintain absolute authority over thousands of people's lives and livelihoods seems completely insane to us now, but that's exactly what happened throughout most of human history because people didn't have better options for dealing with psychological disorders. So the next time you're feeling frustrated with your job, take a moment to be grateful that your boss is probably not going to suddenly decide they're made of glass, forget their own identity, or try to murder you with medieval weapons during a board meeting. Your worst workplace complaint probably sounds pretty reasonable compared to having to secretly govern an entire kingdom while cleaning up after a monarch who thinks he's a wild animal. And remember, if your job is really that bad, you have options that the servants of Charles VI could never even dream of. You can quit, file complaints, seek legal protection, or find employment elsewhere. You don't have to spend 30 years of your life managing a homicidal madman while pretending everything is perfectly normal. So what exactly are we supposed to learn from this absolutely insane historical nightmare? And how can the story of Charles VI and his long-suffering servants possibly provide any useful guidance for our modern lives? Well, aside from the obvious lesson that we should all be incredibly grateful for contemporary workplace safety regulations and mental health care, there are actually some surprisingly profound insights hidden within this medieval horror show that apply to situations we still face today. First and most importantly, the story of Charles VI teaches us about the incredible power of loyalty, dedication, and teamwork in the face of impossible circumstances. Think about what those royal servants accomplished. They kept an entire kingdom functioning for over 30 years while their official leader was completely incapacitated, and they did it without any legal authority, without any recognition, and without any guarantee that they wouldn't be executed for their efforts. They created complex systems for making governmental decisions, managing international relations, and maintaining social order, all while pretending that their contributions were simply following orders from a competent king. These people essentially invented collaborative leadership and crisis management techniques that modern business schools would probably charge thousands of dollars to teach, and they did it out of pure necessity while working under conditions that would make Navy SEAL training look like a relaxing vacation. The servants of Charles VI also demonstrate the importance of adaptability and creative problem-solving when dealing with unprecedented challenges. Nobody had ever written a manual for how to govern a kingdom while your boss thinks he's made of glass. So these people had to invent entirely new approaches to communication, decision-making, and authority management in real time while the fate of millions of people hung in the balance. They developed innovative solutions for everything from silent communication systems to forging royal signatures to managing violent psychotic episodes, and they had to constantly adjust their strategies as Charles VI's condition evolved and presented new challenges. Their ability to think creatively and work collaboratively under extreme pressure probably prevented France from collapsing into complete chaos and civil war, which means these unsung heroes literally saved European history through their ingenuity and persistence. Another crucial lesson from this story is about the dangers of concentrating too much power in a single individual, regardless of how competent or trustworthy that person might seem. The entire crisis of Charles VI's reign occurred because medieval political systems were designed around the assumption that kings were divinely chosen and therefore inherently capable of making good decisions, which left no backup plans for situations where the king turned out to be completely insane. If France had possessed better systems of checks and balances, institutional oversight, and shared authority, Charles VI's mental illness might have been manageable rather than catastrophic. Modern democratic governments, corporate structures, and social institutions all benefit from the hard-learned lesson that no single person should have absolute authority over important decisions, because even the most capable leaders can become incapacitated by illness, corruption, or simple human error. The story also illustrates the importance of honest communication and transparency in leadership, even when the truth is uncomfortable or inconvenient. The royal servant's decision to hide Charles VI's condition and maintain the illusion of competent leadership was understandable given their limited options, but it also created long-term problems that probably made the overall crisis worse than it needed to be. If the French people had known the truth about their king's mental state, they might have been able to develop more sustainable solutions for governance and succession planning, rather than living in a state of deception that eventually led to political chaos and institutional collapse. This lesson applies to modern organizations as well. Leaders who try to hide serious problems or maintain false appearances often create more damage than they prevent, because people can't make good decisions without accurate information about their circumstances. But perhaps the most important moral of this story is about recognizing and appreciating the often invisible work that keeps our societies functioning during difficult times. The servants of Charles VI received no credit, no recognition, and no reward for literally holding together an entire kingdom during one of the most challenging periods in European history, and their contributions were largely forgotten by historians who focused on the dramatic aspects of royal madness rather than the practical heroism of the people who managed the crisis. In our own times, we're surrounded by people who perform essential but underappreciated work. Healthcare workers who keep our medical systems running during emergencies, teachers who educate children despite inadequate resources and support, infrastructure maintenance workers who keep our cities functioning, and countless other individuals whose daily efforts make modern life possible. The story of Charles VI reminds us to pay attention to and appreciate these contributions, because the people doing the unglamorous but essential work are often the ones who prevent our entire society from falling apart during times of crisis. Finally, this bizarre historical episode teaches us something important about resilience and the human capacity to adapt to absolutely anything if necessary. The servants working for Charles VI faced challenges that would seem impossible to overcome. Managing a violent, unpredictable, mentally ill employer while secretly running a government and maintaining the stability of an entire kingdom. Yet they found ways to not just survive but actually succeed in their impossible mission, developing innovative solutions and maintaining their dedication despite incredible personal costs. Their example shows us that human beings are capable of far more than we usually imagine, and that even the most overwhelming problems can be addressed through creativity, collaboration, and persistent effort. Of course, we should also learn from their experience that some situations are genuinely unsustainable and that there are limits to what people should be expected to endure, even in service of important causes. The servants of Charles VI paid an enormous psychological price for their loyalty and dedication, and many of them suffered long-term trauma that affected the rest of their lives. Their sacrifice was heroic, but it also demonstrates the importance of seeking help, recognizing when situations are truly impossible, and finding ways to address systemic problems rather than just managing their symptoms indefinitely. But Charles VI is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to absolutely insane royal employers throughout history, and if you thought his glass delusion and violent psychotic episodes were bad, wait until you hear about some of the other monarchs whose servants had to deal with even more bizarre and terrifying workplace conditions that make Charles VI look almost reasonable by comparison. Next time, we're going to dive deep into the story of Roman Emperor Caligula, whose servants had to manage a boss who genuinely believed he was a living god and demanded to be worshipped by everyone around him, including his own family members, and who would randomly decide to execute people during dinner parties just because he was bored and thought their deaths would be entertaining for the other guests. Caligula's servants had to organize elaborate religious ceremonies where they were required to pray to their employer as if he were Zeus or Jupiter, and they had to maintain straight faces while their supposedly divine boss appointed his favorite horse to important government positions and held serious political conversations with the animal as if it could actually respond to policy questions. But Caligula's religious delusions were just the beginning of his workplace insanity, because he also developed an obsession with military conquest that led him to declare war on the sea itself, ordering his soldiers to march to the beach and attack the waves with their swords while collecting seashells as spoils of war from their victory over Neptune. Imagine being the military aide responsible for organizing these beach battles against the ocean, or being the logistics coordinator who had to supply an entire army for a campaign against water itself, or being the poor secretary who had to write official reports about Rome's glorious triumph over the Mediterranean Sea and the strategic importance of the seashells they had captured during their aquatic invasion. We'll also explore the horrifying working conditions faced by the servants of Ivan the Terrible, whose name should give you a pretty good idea of what kind of employer he was, and whose psychotic episodes made Charles VI's violent outbursts look like minor temper tantrums. Ivan's servants had to work in a palace where the floor was literally covered with the bodies of people their boss had tortured to death during his most recent rage episode, and they had to step over corpses while performing their daily duties because Ivan enjoyed surrounding himself with evidence of his own cruelty and violence. These servants developed elaborate early warning systems to detect when Ivan was entering one of his murderous moods, and they would quietly evacuate entire sections of the palace to minimize the number of people who might accidentally trigger his homicidal impulses. But even their most careful precautions couldn't always prevent random massacres when Ivan decided that everyone around him was secretly plotting against his rule. The story gets even more disturbing when we learn about Ivan's treatment of his own family members, including the time he killed his own son during a violent argument and then spent weeks crying and begging his servants to bring the dead prince back to life through prayer and magic, while also threatening to execute anyone who reminded him that resurrection was probably not going to happen. Then there's the absolutely fascinating case of Ludwig II of Bavaria, also known as the Mad King Ludwig, whose servants had to accommodate their employer's complete detachment from reality and his obsession with building elaborate fairy tale castles that consumed the entire Bavarian treasury and nearly bankrupted the kingdom. Ludwig's servants found themselves working for a king who preferred the company of imaginary friends to real human beings, who would hold elaborate dinner parties for fictional characters from operas and fairy tales, setting places at the table for people who didn't exist and having conversations with empty chairs while his servants stood around pretending this was perfectly normal royal behavior. Ludwig also had an obsession with swans that reached truly bizarre levels, and his servants had to maintain dozens of live swans throughout his various castles, ensuring that these birds were fed, cleaned, and cared for better than most human beings because the king believed they were magical creatures that could communicate with him telepathically. The logistics of swan maintenance alone must have been a full-time job, but Ludwig's servants also had to coordinate his midnight rides through the Bavarian countryside, where he would dress up in elaborate costumes and pretend to be characters from Wagner operas while riding through the forest in a golden sleigh pulled by horses that were also wearing theatrical costumes. And we can't forget about Emperor Nero, whose servants had to manage a boss who was convinced he was the greatest artist in human history and would force entire audiences to sit through his terrible poetry recitals and musical performances that could last for hours, with guards stationed at the exits to prevent anyone from leaving early and risking execution for insulting the emperor's artistic genius. Nero's servants had to organize these mandatory cultural events where thousands of people would be required to applaud enthusiastically for performances that were so bad they would make modern reality TV look sophisticated, and they had to coordinate the complex logistics of forcing an entire empire to pretend their emperor was talented while secretly knowing that his artistic abilities were roughly equivalent to those of a tone-deaf middle school student with delusions of grandeur. So if you want to hear more stories about the most psychologically demanding and dangerous jobs in human history, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell, because we're going to explore the workplace nightmares of serving some of history's most unhinged and terrifying royal employers, and I guarantee that these stories will make you appreciate your current job situation in ways you never thought possible. And that, my friends, brings us to the end of one of the most absolutely insane workplace horror stories in all of human history, and I hope that after spending the last hour and a half learning about the nightmare that was working for Charles VI, you have a completely new appreciation for just how good you have it in your current job, no matter how difficult or frustrating your boss might seem on their worst day. We've taken an incredible journey through medieval France, exploring what it was really like to work for a king who thought he was made of glass, who forgot his own identity, who attacked people with swords during psychotic episodes, and who eventually descended into such complete animalistic behavior that his servants had to clean up his waste while he ran naked through the palace howling like a rabid beast. We've seen how his loyal servants essentially invented crisis management, collaborative leadership, and government continuity planning out of pure necessity, creating systems and solutions that kept an entire kingdom functioning for over 30 years while their official leader was completely incapacitated. These unsung heroes of medieval history demonstrated levels of creativity, dedication, and resilience that would be impressive in any era, and they did it all while facing daily threats of violence, psychological trauma, and moral dilemmas that had no right answers. But more than just being an entertaining story about historical weirdness, the saga of Charles VI and his servants teaches us important lessons about leadership, teamwork, adaptability, and the often invisible work that keeps our societies functioning during times of crisis. Their experience shows us the dangers of concentrating too much power in a single individual, the importance of honest communication and transparency in organizations, and the incredible capacity that human beings have to adapt and find solutions to even the most impossible circumstances. If you enjoyed learning about this bizarre chapter in European history, I absolutely need you to hit that subscribe button right now, because we have so many more incredible stories about history's most insane rulers and the people who had to work for them. Seriously, Charles VI is just one example from a whole collection of completely unhinged monarchs who made their employees' lives absolutely miserable in the most creative and disturbing ways imaginable. Make sure you ring that notification bell too, because you don't want to miss our upcoming videos about Caligula, Ivan the Terrible, Mad King Ludwig, Emperor Nero, and dozens of other royal employers who would make your worst boss look like a saint by comparison. I also want to hear from you in the comments section about your own workplace horror stories, because while I'm pretty confident that none of you have had to deal with a boss who literally thought they were made of glass, I'm sure many of you have encountered managers and supervisors who seemed almost as detached from reality as Charles VI. Tell us about the strangest, most unreasonable, or most difficult employer you've ever had to deal with, and let's see how your experiences compare to those of medieval royal servants who had to secretly run entire governments while managing homicidal madmen. And please give this video a thumbs up if you found it interesting, educational, or just entertainingly bizarre, because it really helps us reach more people who might enjoy learning about these forgotten corners of history. The algorithm loves engagement, and your likes, comments, and shares are what allow us to keep researching and creating content about the weird, wonderful, and absolutely insane aspects of human history that most people never hear about. If you're interested in more stories about medieval life, royal madness, or just general historical weirdness, check out our playlist of related videos where we explore everything from the strangest medical treatments in history to the most bizarre religious practices of the Middle Ages. We've got hours of content about the crazy things people used to believe and do, and I guarantee you'll find something that makes Charles VI's glass delusion seem almost reasonable by comparison. You can also follow us on social media for behind-the-scenes content, additional historical facts that didn't make it into the main videos, and previews of upcoming episodes that we're working on. We love connecting with our audience and hearing your thoughts about these historical stories, so don't be shy about reaching out and letting us know what topics you'd like us to cover in future videos. Before we wrap up completely, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the incredible research work that went into creating this video, because the story of Charles VI and his servants required diving deep into medieval historical records, court documents, and scholarly analyses that aren't exactly easy to find or interpret. We spent months verifying facts, cross-referencing sources, and making sure that every bizarre detail we shared with you was actually supported by historical evidence, because we know that truth is often stranger than fiction, and we want to make sure we're giving you the real story rather than just entertaining legends. The dedication and sacrifice of those medieval servants who kept France functioning during Charles VI's reign deserves to be remembered and honored, even 600 years later, and we hope that by telling their story we've given them some of the recognition they never received during their own lifetimes. Their experience reminds us that history is made not just by the famous rulers and powerful leaders whose names appear in textbooks, but also by the countless ordinary people who do extraordinary things when circumstances demand it, often without any acknowledgement or reward for their efforts. So as we close out this incredible journey through one of history's most challenging workplaces, remember that every time you face a difficult situation at work, every time you have to deal with unreasonable demands or frustrating circumstances, you're part of a long tradition of people who have found ways to persevere and succeed despite impossible odds. The servants of Charles VI proved that human beings are capable of adapting to absolutely anything when they have to, and their example should inspire us to approach our own challenges with creativity, collaboration, and determination. Thank you so much for joining us on this wild ride through medieval France, and we'll see you in the next video where we'll explore another fascinating and completely insane chapter from the history of human workplace experiences. Until then, be grateful for your boring, sane, non-glass-obsessed employers, and remember that no matter how bad your job gets, at least your boss probably isn't going to try to kill you with a medieval sword during your next performance review.